On December 23, 1783, George Washington resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. For the next 3 years, he led a quiet life of farming at Mount Vernon. However, in the fall of 1786, he began to receive alarming reports of revolution coming from Massachusetts. Newspapers were reporting that a mob of some 4,000 indebted farmers had organized themselves into an army and were shutting down courts throughout Massachusetts. It was suggested that the government of Massachusetts itself was in danger of being overthrown by the radicals. Adding to Washington's concerns was a letter about the situation written to him by friend and former artillery chief Henry Knox. In October, Knox wrote, "The numbers of these people may amount in Massachusetts to 1/5 part of several populous counties, and to them may be added the people of similar sentiments from the states of Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, so as to constitute a body of 12 or 15,000. In a word, they are determined to annihilate all debts, public and private, and have agrarian laws. Something must be done, or we shall be involved in all the horror of faction and civil war without a prospect of its termination." Knox paints a picture of the rebellion as a large interstate insurrection of farmers looking to get their debts extinguished. He suggests the rebellion may even end in civil war. David Humphreys, a former Washington aide who lived in New Haven, seems to confirm Knox's report. He writes, "The troubles in Massachusetts still continue. Government is prostrated in the dust, and it is much to be feared that there is not energy enough in that state to re-establish the civil powers. There is a licentious spirit prevailing among the people, a leveling principle, a desire of change, and wish to annihilate all debts, public and private." Washington relied heavily on the reports from Knox and Humphreys and was clearly agitated. Was the nation he sacrificed 8 years to help form about to dissolve into one of anarchy and revolution? In November, he wrote a letter to General Benjamin Lincoln in Massachusetts, in which he lamented, "Are your people getting mad? Are we to have the goodly fabric that 8 years were spent in rearing pulled over our heads? What is the cause of all these commotions? When and how is it to end?" For all intents and purposes, the rebellion will end in February 1787. However, Washington wanted to know the cause of the rebellion. Knox and Humphreys offered one. It had been the standard one for years. Was it the correct one, though? Let's take a look at what happened in western Massachusetts in the fall and winter of 1786 to 87, and discover how these events may have been used as a catalyst for one of the most important events in American history. In 1786, most of western Massachusetts consisted of small family-owned farms. Since the soil in this area was generally rocky, it was difficult for many farmers to eke out a living. A depressed economy coupled with rising taxes caused most farms to be barely self-sustaining. To add to the farmers' hardship, Massachusetts required taxes to be paid in hard money, silver or gold. No paper money was accepted for payment. Since silver and gold were in short supply, this became extremely difficult. Additionally, many farmers had taken on debt to keep their farms afloat. Now, many holders of that debt also demanded payment in hard money. Farmers who previously paid their debt in paper money, produce, or labor now found themselves in severe financial trouble. In the years from 1780 to 1784, though times were difficult for the farmers, the governor in office was generally sympathetic to their plight. Governor John Hancock, understanding that many farmers were former soldiers who had suffered economically during the war, was less than vigorous in enforcing the tax laws. However, in January 1785, after Hancock left office, the situation turned dramatically worse for the farmers. When their debts could not be paid, they were often hauled into court. From 1784 to 1786, in the farming community of Hampshire County, Massachusetts, 31.4% of the county's men over 16 were taken to court. The numbers were similar in Worcester, Essex, Bristol, and Berkshire counties. Some lost their lands. Berkshire County Judge William Whiting noted, "Great numbers of farmers have been constantly stripped of whatever little stocks they possessed, and those often sold at auction for a mere trifling. Others were thrown into jail. In Hampshire County from July 1784 to December 1786, the average 2-month period saw 73 men sent to jail for relatively small debts." These numbers were similar in other counties. Historian David Satmary quotes a Massachusetts farmer who summed up the situation of many. "Our taxes are so high, together with calls of a private nature, that our stock and cattle are greatly diminished. The greater part, then, of those who gloriously supported our independence now find their movables vanishing like empty shades, their lands sinking under their feet." Many of these men were former Revolutionary War soldiers who now found themselves living in a country very different from the one they had envisioned at the war's end. The citizens of Western Massachusetts initially responded to their situation as they did before the Declaration of Independence. They petitioned their government for a redress of grievances. Between 1784 to 1787, 73 rural Massachusetts towns, 30% of all towns, sent petitions to the legislature in Boston asking them to alleviate the burden on the farmers. This one, from the town of Athol, is typical. "We, therefore, your petitioners, in behalf of the town assembly, shew we are reduced to the most distressing situation by suits being daily commenced against the inhabitants of this as well as many other parts of this commonwealth. Our jails filled, and still our debts not discharged, but our property daily diminishing greatly to the injury of the debtors. Therefore we beg your honors would take our situation into consideration, and do something for the relief of your petitioners." For 4 years, these types of town petitions flooded the legislature. For 4 years, they were ignored by the legislature. On July 8, 1786, the Massachusetts legislature adjourned until January 31, 1787. They again refused to address the petitions from the western section. The towns were now determined to act. In order to determine how to respond to the news from Boston, towns began calling emergency meetings of their governing boards, called Selectmen. On July 18th, the town of Pelham in Hampshire County called its meeting. As was the custom, town meetings were held at local taverns. In Pelham, it was Conkey's Tavern. The Selectmen of Pelham decided to write letters to 11 other neighboring towns, calling for a meeting on July 31st at John Bruce's Inn. This meeting, in turn, produced a call for a convention of the entire Hampshire County. The Selectmen of Pelham, in a letter to the Selectmen of Amherst, stated the goal of the convention: "Find some method to change the state constitution and thus get a more responsive government." By July 23rd, a county convention was already held in Bristol. Meetings were also planned for Worcester, Middlesex, and Berkshire counties. Hampshire County met on August 22nd and was the largest. 50 Hampshire towns were represented. Among the notables in attendance were Hatfield's Colonel Seth Murray, John Hastings, Hatfield's representative to the state legislature, Benjamin Ely, West Springfield's former state representative, and William Pynchon, leader of West Springfield's most distinguished family. The convention was hardly a mob of lawless, indebted farmers. The convention proposed, submit a list of grievances and then break up the court next week. The list of grievances composed by Hampshire County contained 21 articles and gives us an insight into the ideological catalyst for Shays' rebellion. Some of the main articles called for a radical change in the state government. First, the state constitution was to be amended. Second, the upper chamber of the legislature abandoned and qualifications for the lower revised. Third, there was to be a major revision in the state's court system. Fourth, the tax code was to be revised. Fifth, the scarcity of legal tender was to be addressed. Also, Hampshire County wanted the legislature to be called back into session immediately to address its grievances. This was not simply a call for relief of debt. In the minds of the citizens of Hampshire County, there was something seriously wrong with the government of Massachusetts. One area of major contention was the Constitution of 1780. In the fall of 1780, 3.5 years after declaring independence from Britain, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts held a statewide convention at Boston for the purpose of drafting a new constitution. The task was assigned to a committee consisting of Sam Adams, future Governor James Bowden, and John Adams. John Adams did most of the writing. The constitutional delegates were to return to Boston in the winter to ratify the Constitution. However, that winter was one of the worst in the history of Massachusetts. Many delegates from western Massachusetts could not make the trip because of impassable roads. Only 47 out of originally 247 towns were represented. Most of those towns were within 10 to 15 miles from Boston. These 47 towns made the final decision on what would constitute the text of the Constitution. Some of the articles contained in the new Constitution were particularly odious to the towns in western Massachusetts. The legislature, or general court as they called it, consisted of 2 chambers, an upper and lower. In order to hold office in the Senate, one had to have £300 in land holdings and £600 in total wealth. The requirement for holding office in the House of Representatives was £100 in land holdings within the town, or a total estate valued at £200. The requirement for holding office of governor was £1,000 in land. Many in western Massachusetts felt this disqualified many from office and ensured that the reins of government would remain in the hands of wealthy men, especially those in Boston. Further, the court system contained many complicated layers with an appointed judiciary. Many believed the judicial system created by the Constitution was unfair, as it complicated the legal system, thus increasing fees and enriching lawyers. Finally, no amendments to the new Constitution were to be allowed for 15 years. With this provision, many recognized that if the Constitution proved unjust, there would be no way to remedy the situation. Particularly offensive to those of western Massachusetts was the qualification for voting. The vote for state officers was limited to white men who had a net worth of £60. This was £20 more than required by the British under the old colonial charter. Several towns expressed their opposition to the voter qualification clause and property requirements for state office enumerated in the Constitution. 30 towns felt that any man who was respected in the community or who served in the militia and defended the Commonwealth should have the right to vote. The town of Coleraine on the voting clause protested, "Taxation without representation we consider unreasonable." On holding elective office, they added, "We consider money no qualification in this matter." Belchertown rejected property qualification for voting, saying that it denied that liberty and freedom which we this day are contending for. The town of Greenwich said it violated natural rights. New Salem suggested it was unjust to tax men without their consent. The town of Petersham said riches and dignity neither makes the head wiser nor the heart better. Interestingly, the future U.S. Constitution would allow the right to vote and the ability to hold federal office regardless of property holding. Professor Leonard Richards has this to say about the Constitution of 1780. The Constitution of 1780 undoubtedly consolidated power in the hands of the mercantile elite and the eastern part of the state. It shifted power from the rural backcountry to Boston, from the poor to the rich, and from town meetings to the state senate and governor's office. Towns in western Massachusetts would soon discover how the senate and governor's office intended to use their power, especially when it concerned taxes. In financing the Revolutionary War, the federal government and the individual states amassed a heavy debt. It is estimated that the state's debt alone totaled $25 million. Much of that debt was created by the issuance of notes or IOUs that acted as payment for soldiers' salaries and supplies. Professor Richards tells us that Massachusetts issued about £1.5 million in these notes. Conservatively, this compares to about $600 million in today's money. The holders of these notes, however, soon discovered that their value rapidly depreciated. Notes issued in 1778 quickly fell to 25% of their face value. By 1781, they fell to 2%. A note issued in 1778 for $8 was worth 16 cents in 1781. Massachusetts was not unique. Virginia's notes fell to 1/1000th of their face value. Federal notes fell to 1/40th. Soldiers who received pay in these notes were particularly hurt by their depreciation. Many, in order to feed their families and keep their farms functioning, parted with them at steep discounts. Also, former soldiers who were now farmers experiencing hard economic times often sold their notes, some at a 90% loss. Following the war, the difficult question before the state governments was how to redeem the notes. Should they be redeemed at face value or at the current market value? The Massachusetts legislature, dominated by Boston's mercantile interests, decided to redeem the notes at face value. It was the only state to do so. This decision left the state of Massachusetts with an enormous debt. However, it also allowed some men the possibility of becoming very wealthy. While it is impossible to trace the identity of all those who eventually wound up with the Massachusetts notes, it is known that 80% of those who speculated in the notes lived within or near Boston. 35 men held almost 40% of the notes. Since most of these notes were bought at steep discounts, these men stood to reap a bonanza if the notes were paid at face value. One of these men was James Bowden, president of the committee that drafted the Constitution of 1780, the first president of the only bank in Boston, and governor from 1785 to 1787. He held 3,290 pounds in state notes. William Phillips, who succeeded Bowden as bank president, held notes equaling 28,000 pounds. Phillips' partner, Jonathan Mason, amassed 30,000 pounds in notes. It is suspected that most of Phillips and Mason's notes came from former soldiers. Of all the 35 men who held 40% of the Massachusetts state debt, either they or a close relative served in the state house in the 1780s. Undoubtedly, these men had a vested interest in how their notes would be paid. Once the Massachusetts legislature had determined to pay its outstanding notes at face value, it in effect doubled its debt. The question now was how to pay it. First, Massachusetts stipulated that the owners of the notes would be paid in hard money. Second, it was decided that starting in 1784, the debt would be paid by 1789. In order to satisfy these measures, heavy taxes payable in hard money would be required. Massachusetts decided upon two tax-raising measures. The first was a property tax, which accounted for 60% of the taxes. The second was a poll tax. All males over 16 years of age were required to pay a head tax. Some question the equitability of these taxes. Historian David Satmary notes that the property tax favored the mercantile interests centered in Boston. Most of their assets were in stock. They therefore paid little tax compared to landowners. The remainder of the burden fell largely on the yeomanry. Leonard Richards makes this comment about the tax situation. Only about 10% of the taxes were to come from import duties and excises, which fell mainly on people who were most able to pay. The other 90% was direct taxes on property, with land bearing a disproportionate share, and polls. The latter was especially regressive, since it mattered not a whit if a male 16 years of age or older had any property or not. Rich or poor, he was going to have to pay the same amount, and altogether polls were going to pay at least 1/3 of all taxes. The fact that the tax burden appeared to be shifted to farmers with grown sons to the benefit of some in Boston was not lost on the farmers. In 1785, James Bowden was selected as governor after John Hancock decided not to run. Unlike former Governor John Hancock, Bowden insisted that all the taxes be collected. Leonard Richards notes the prospects Western farmers faced under a Bowden administration. The combined load of overdue taxes and new taxes was more than many residents could pay in a year, 5 years, or even a lifetime. Taxes under Great Britain were minimal compared to the new rates. Both Rufus King, future signer of the U.S. Constitution, and John Adams expressed sentiments that taxes were heavier than the people could bear. A heavy tax burden imposed on many who could not participate in the electoral process, an economic depression, and a non-representative government created a volatile situation in western Massachusetts. The people were now ready to respond. 1 week after the Hampshire County meeting on August 29, 1786, several hundred well-organized men from the towns of Pelham and Greenwich, under the command of Captain Joseph Hines and Militia Captain Deacon John Thompson, marched toward Northampton with the intention of closing the Court of Common Pleas. These were the courts that judged dead suits. The town of Pelham asked Daniel Shays to lead the men of Pelham, but he refused. Along the way, they were joined by a large contingent of men from Amherst, commanded by Captain Joel Billings. As they approached Northampton, they met another large group from Springfield, under Captain Luke Day. Day had served as a captain in the Continental Army from the Siege of Boston to the Siege of Yorktown. The following morning, about 1,500 protesters entered Northampton and proceeded to the courthouse. Captain Day stood on the steps with a petition for the judges. It stated that it was inconvenient to the people of the state for the courts to sit that day, and entreated the judges to adjourn until the petitions of the conventions might be granted by the general court. The court was subsequently closed. The protesters came to adopt the name Regulators. The term was used for North Carolina protesters in the 1760s who took up arms against corrupt British officials. On September 5th, several hundred regulators closed down the court in Worcester County. The Worcester County militia refused to stop the closing. In fact, many joined the uprising. Government officer General Jonathan Warner commented, "Notwithstanding the most pressing orders, there did appear universally a reluctance in the people to turn out for the support of government." Chief Justice Artemus Ward noted that the militia in Worcester was too generally in favor of the people's measures. Governor Bowden was in shock. The following week, Captain Job Shattuck and 100 men closed the Middlesex County Court in Concord. On September 26, 1786, the Supreme Judicial Court was to convene in Springfield. Although protected by some 800 men in a militia under General William Shepard, 1,200 men under the command of Luke Day and Daniel Shays succeeded in closing the court. Daniel Shays apparently began taking a more active role in the uprising. Shays, a farmer and also a former captain in the Continental Army, had been honored with a sword by Lafayette for his distinguished service. Throughout September and October, courts were also closed in Great Barrington and Taunton. To complicate matters for the legislature, some politicians were becoming sympathetic to the insurgents' cause. Moses Harvey from the state legislature in Hampshire County, a former captain in the Continental Army, now captain in the state militia, refused to back the state and join the rebellion. He characterized the state legislature as thieves, knaves, robbers, and highwaymen. Dr. William Whiting, Chief Justice of the Berkshire County Court, called them overgrown plunderers. Influential men in Boston began calling for harsh measures to put down the insurrection. Samuel Adams commented, "In monarchies, the crime of treason and rebellion may admit to being pardoned or lightly punished, but the man who dares rebel against the laws of a republic ought to suffer death." The legislature passed the Militia Act on October 24th. It declared, "Whosoever, officer or soldier, shall abandon any post committed to his charge, or shall speak words inducing others to do the like in time of engagement, shall suffer death." A riot act was passed on October 28th, which declared, "Sheriffs and other officials shall be indemnified and held guiltless for killing rioters who failed to disperse or resisted capture, and that the rioters shall forfeit all their lands, tenements, goods, and chattels to the Commonwealth." On November 10th, 2 weeks later, a resolution suspending habeas corpus was enacted. This allowed the government to imprison rioters without a trial. Some concessions to farmers were made. Certain taxes could be paid in kind for some back taxes, and the payment of current taxes were to be delayed until April 1st, 1787. These measures did not appease the regulators. The protests continued. On November 28th, Governor Bowden issued an arrest warrant for 5 men. All 5 were Revolutionary War veterans. The man they most wanted was Job Shattuck. He was 50 years old and the largest landowner in Groton, with 500 acres and a 3-story house. On the 30th, 400 horsemen captured Shattuck and 2 others. Shattuck was slashed across the knee with a saber, taken to Boston, and jailed without trial. The capture and wounding of Shattuck seems to have radicalized the farmers in the western part of the state. Some men made their feelings public. Sylvanus Billings, in an address to the good people of Boylston, stated that tyrants who are fighting for the promotion and to advance their interest, which will destroy the good people of this land. He said there was no other choice but to join the rebels. Dr. Isaac Chenery of Holden proclaimed, "Living under rulers that have been cutting and hacking our people was not to be suffered. He would rather be under the devil than such a government as this." He now prayed for the overthrow of the government. In December, Daniel Shays and Luke Day rode to Springfield, leading 300 well-drilled regulators. They took possession of the Court of Common Pleas and petitioned the judges not to convene. The judges took their advice and adjourned. On January 4th, 1787, Governor Bowden, without legislative authority, decided to hire an army for the purpose of putting down the rebellion. The call went out for 4,400 men to be commanded by former Revolutionary War General Benjamin Lincoln. To fund the army, Bowden turned to Boston businessmen. 153 private citizens, including banker William Phillips and Bowden himself, contributed to the cause. None of the 153 served in the army. The regulators, realizing that they would be at a serious disadvantage to the well-equipped force, decided to capture the federal armory at Springfield. The armory contained several cannons and 7,000 new muskets. They organized about 1,400 men into 3 groups under Shays, Eli Parsons, and Luke Day. They chose January 25th as the day to attack. Unfortunately for the regulators, General William Shepard had already occupied the arsenal with 1,200 militia. Shays and Parsons attacked on the 25th, however, due to a miscommunication. Day and his men never participated in the attack. As Shays and Parsons' men moved on the armory, Shepard issued a warning to cease the advance. After the regulators refused, Shepard had his men fire volleys of grape shot into the regulators. Most of the men ran. 4 men were killed, and 20 were wounded. Most of the regulators fled north toward Amherst and Northampton. The regulators reorganized at Petersham. However, on the nights of February 3rd through 4th, Benjamin Lincoln's army surprised them. Most of the leaders, including Daniel Shays, fled to New Hampshire and then on into Vermont. On February 16th, the legislature passed the Disqualification Act. Pardons were offered to privates and non-commissioned officers who took part in Shays' rebellion. The terms consisted of the following. First, the rebels must take an oath of allegiance and pay a 9-pence fine. Second, they must turn in their guns. Third, they barred all rebels from serving on juries, holding town office or other office. Fourth, they barred all rebels from voting for military or civil officers. Fifth, they barred them from employment as schoolmasters, innkeepers, or sellers of spirits. However, if they could prove their unfailing allegiance to the state on or after May 1st, 1788, they would no longer be barred from being a juror, voting, or being members of government or certain professions. Reverend Bezaleel Howard, pastor of the First Church of Springfield, stated, "The severe and tyrannical Disqualification Act was the product of a wicked and corrupt heart." Following the rout at Petersham, the regulators were no longer a serious threat to the government of Massachusetts. There were a few minor battles and skirmishes, but the rebellion died with a whimper. Governor Chittenden and Ethan Allen of Vermont refused to turn over the insurgent leaders to Massachusetts, even though they were living on a farm next to the governor. About 4,000 regulators signed oaths of allegiance. Through those historical documents, it was found that many of these men were pillars of their community. All of the leaders were eventually pardoned. 2 men were hanged for looting. Did Shays' Rebellion help the farmers in western Massachusetts? In May 1787, John Hancock soundly defeated James Bowden for governor. The legislature of 1787 put a moratorium on debts and significantly cut direct taxes by 90%. In 1786, the average family in western Massachusetts had to pay nearly £3 for every male 16 years or older. In the next 5 years combined, the total was less than half that amount. The annual tax rate in towns like Amherst, Pelham, and Coleraine dropped from 25 shillings to less than 2 shillings. Indirect taxes, excises, and imposts no longer went to pay interest on the state notes. Subsequently, interest on the state notes fell into arrears, and notes depreciated about 30% on the Boston market. The speculators would have to find another way to reap a fortune through their notes. A consolidation of state debt by the federal government was their last hope. Historian Leonard Richards notes that the movement for a stronger national government was well on its way when the rebellion began. Since 1781, leaders throughout the states, sensing a deficiency in the Articles of Confederation, had been calling for its revision. Many believed that Congress had to be granted more power over the states in order for the nation to succeed. Even George Washington was in the nationalist camp. However, since he had retired from public life, he did not actively promote any policy. The uncertainty of what a change in the Articles would do to the balance of power between the states and the federal government dissuaded many from acting. Others, however, had stronger opinions. Alexander Hamilton of New York and other nationalists sought a powerful federal government and proposed a wholesale revision of the Articles. This was no easy task, since changing the Articles required consent of the legislature of all 13 states. But the nationalists had a plan. In September 1786, the Annapolis Convention endorsed a resolution by Alexander Hamilton that all 13 states send delegates to a general convention to be held at Philadelphia in May 1787. The stated goal of the General Convention was to devise such further provisions as shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. In order for the Philadelphia Convention to be a success, they needed a leader to give the convention credibility. They needed George Washington. Shays' Rebellion provided the means for getting him there. The letter sent by Henry Knox to George Washington in October 1786 was typical of many he received during the rebellion. Knox's letter to George Washington was more than a simple update on the disturbances in Massachusetts. He writes, "The powers of Congress are totally inadequate to preserve the balance between the respective states." Knox is clearly a nationalist and suggests to Washington that the Articles of Confederation are inadequate to maintaining the peace. He continues on concerning Shays' Rebellion. "The fine theoretic government of Massachusetts has given way, and its laws are trampled underfoot. Men at a distance are apt to accuse the rulers and say that taxes have been assessed too high and collected too rigidly. This is a deception. The people who are the insurgents have never paid any or by very little taxes." As we have seen, it seems Knox is the one using deception. He goes on as to the motivation of the regulators. "The creed is that the property of the United States has been protected from the confiscations of Britain by the joint exertions of all, and therefore ought to be the common property of all. They are chiefly of the young and active part of the community." However, Knox seems to be mischaracterizing the ideology of the regulators. They were obviously not communists seeking to possess others' property. They were often pillars of the community seeking lower taxes and a fair legal system. Knox continues, "Our government must be braced, changed, or altered to secure our lives and property." Knox tells Washington that if the present government is not changed, lives and property are in danger. Knox is intimating that the Articles of Confederation had to be changed to allow for a national military response to a rebellion like Shays. In light of Shays' rebellion, scores of letters like this one seem to sway Washington. Interestingly, however, Thomas Jefferson did not seem alarmed at the events in Massachusetts. Concerning Shays' rebellion, in a letter to James Madison, he wrote, "I hold it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing." Shortly after Knox's letter to Washington, a letter from James Madison arrived. Madison indicated that he had taken the liberty of putting Washington's name at the head of the list of delegates to attend the convention in Philadelphia. He thought this would add a very solemn dress and all the weight that could be derived from a single state. Eventually, Washington agreed to come out of retirement and go to the convention. What was the effect of Washington's presence at the Constitutional Convention? Professor Richards writes, "His participation in the formation of the new Constitution provided the most effective propaganda the Nationalists could engage to accomplish their objectives." What were the objectives of the Nationalists? Not simply a revision of the Articles, but the formation of an entirely new system of government. Shays' rebellion was an important event in making it come about.